Hey everyone, and welcome to the 51st edition of DF Direct Weekly. It's Digital Foundry's weekly show where we discuss the latest gaming and technology news. It's actually our 1 year anniversary, 51 episodes, 52 weeks. We had a week off at Christmas. But happy anniversary, first of all, to Alex Battaglia.
Happy anniversary, Rich. Happy anniversary, mystery guest number 3. I'm super happy that we started doing this. At first, it was a bit rocky. We had to get our footing. We had to get used to talking about topics every week. And I think we've reached kind of a groove here that is really awesome. And I think the audience response has been incredible. So thank you in the audience for watching.
Exactly, yes. And obviously joining us, mystery guest number 3. I think it's actually mystery guest number 2. It is Tom Morgan.
Hello. I'm back with the giant microphone, as always. And ready to go.
But your raid-faced bedpost is no longer part of the picture.
No, I've just got a radiator instead, which I know is a bit of a downgrade, but...
Yeah, more diffuse reflections on that one. Anyway, let's kick off with the first topic. We've got so much to discuss this week, but it's going to be dominated, obviously, by Steam Deck and Elden Ring. So many questions. We're going to try and cram in as many supporter questions as possible on this. But first of all, let's start with discussion on Steam Deck. Yes, Steam Deck. I've got another one coming, and I'll be heading straight over to Berlin to give it to you, Alex.
Yes.
But I'm very curious. Obviously, I've had the machine for a while now. I'm sure you've seen my coverage. You've probably seen other people's coverage. I'm going to go to you first, Alex, because you're the PC man. What's your impressions of this device?
Well, I think we have to look at it differently than we look at a normal device, because with a normal PC, when looking for optimized settings, you are targeting frame rates, I would say usually 60, and you're trying to min-max quality for that performance. And I think with the Steam Deck, and the way I'm going to focus my videos on it is that we should, I think, really focus on its unplugged experience, its mobile experience, and maximizing the battery life potential there at a steady 30 FPS, which is very different than what I would usually do for most games, honestly. At least, I would say for the more premium top-tier AAA games, for lesser experiences that are less power demanding, then I still think 60 FPS is a great target. And I think that's the core difference that I took away from your coverage, looking at how absolutely battery sapping unlocked frame rates are, how they're also not necessarily always the best for performance in general, which makes sense in a constrained environment with bandwidth contention between CPU and GPU with that shared LPDDR4 RAM there. And I think that's the way I'm going to do my coverage. And it's the thing I think most people are going to end up be interested in as well, too. In the end, I think you showed off conclusively. And I also think even back when Gamers Nexus did their stuff, that they showed off rather conclusively that we have a very powerful chipset here. But achieving that console-like experience on the go is going to be the key thing that I want to focus on, and the thing I'm most interested in.
Yeah, I think optimized settings here are really interesting because I'm looking at Elden Ring at the moment, and I can make it look as good as the PS4 version and run about the same in terms of performance, but I think the bottlenecks might be slightly different. Obviously, we've got it's running the PC port, which is kind of crazy, which isn't particularly great. But we'll talk about that a bit later on. Here's an interesting question, though, because when we look at optimized settings, you kind of have to you're kind of looking for things in terms of overall quality as it would be judged on a desktop screen, right? And if you actually do the side-by-sides in Elden Ring, the biggest difference between like low and high settings is the grass detail. So I'm kind of curious as to whether we should be trying to pare back settings that you're less likely to see in favor of like the grass setting where the difference is obvious, even on a smaller screen.
I'm going to agree with that. Like, I'm looking at things like the SSAO quality, or things like SSR reflection quality and things like that. Like, those are areas that are going to be massively pared back. And I actually I've started thinking about it, that I'm going to purposely focus on paring back settings that require lots of just general compute. Try and make it run and look more like a mobile game in some aspects may actually have incredible wins for battery life, I think.
Because the kind of second thoughts I'm having about my coverage is that we've got a situation here where we can make the game look like the PS4 version, or actually better. But I'm judging those quality settings based on a head-to-head that's going to be viewed on a larger screen. So it's possibly not the way to actually set up these games. It's really quite interesting. Tom, I'm going to go to you for your thoughts on the Steam Deck.
I got a Steam Deck very well. It was about the same time as you did, I believe. We kind of got this version of it where it wasn't really ready at that time, and it was. So my impression of it was, wow, it's an absolute chonker of a machine. It's also not exactly. I wouldn't say it's the most ergonomic in my opinion, but it's got all the functionality you could possibly want from a handheld in terms of inputs. Like they thought of everything, which is going to future-proof it. I believe there was an article going around, or at least a rumor that the Valve have planned multiple iterations, and they're always thinking of redesigns. And I can definitely see the value in that, because this. I think we'll look back on this if they do reiterate and say, well, this was definitely kind of a prototypey sort of design. Bit like the gamepad on the Wii U to the Switch. I think we'll see that sort of progression in terms of how we view it. But in terms of what it does, my God, it's with all the features that have finally been integrated, like the 30 FPS cap, I think this is a much more exciting creature now.
The thing is, you had to give your deck to Eurogamer. It was actually their deck, so you only had it during the period where it was actually not very good, where the software wasn't working properly. It was 60 FPS or bust basically at that point, because 30 FPS literally did not work when you had the deck. The cap was available. In fact, there were all manner of options in the deck that were in the pre-release software but weren't working, that are now gone. So, for example, a variable resolution setting, which I don't know what it is, but I can't imagine driver level DRS would be doable, but that seemed to be in there. Kind of weird, but yes, basically we had the deck ages before the embargo, but the embargo was on Friday, and to my mind, the device was only reviewable on Monday. Which it wasn't a great week, let's put it that way.
Panic.
It wasn't particularly great, but on the Monday, after a weekend of intense frustration about the device not working really as it should, on Monday we had a system software update. I just dipped into Forza Horizon 5, and suddenly it's like, whoa, this is actually really impressive. It wasn't doing this before. There were all manner of issues with Forza. But when I did first get the deck, what I will say is that, as I said, it was 60 FPS or bust. So if you played Doom Eternal, for example, I mean, that runs incredibly well at 60 FPS on the Steam Deck. Ultra settings, dynamic resolution scaling. The dynamic resolution scaling only kicks in on big explosions and glory kills. So absolutely, you can play it at ultra if you really want to. That opens up battery life considerations, of course. But I'm actually really excited by this device. But it is like a Gen 1 product. I think you're right. There was an interview with Gabe Newell on Eurogamer, where he's talking about the deck years down the line. And it sounds like a very different, more accessible device aimed at mobile gamers. Whereas I view the deck as a device aimed at PC gamers who want a really cool handheld and can bring their library with them, which I think are two very different things. I'm curious if this is all going to marry up eventually into some kind of mass market accessible device. But the thing is, I don't think that you can take away functionality. So I don't know whether it would be like a more console-like UI with the ability to switch into the Steam UI as it is on the deck at the moment.
Yeah, that's a good point. I did, watching your video, Rich, I did think that the UI probably needs you said it's functional, but I think it needs that snappiness of like the PS5 level of snappiness for the UI, not the PS4 level of snappiness for the UI, for example.
That's kind of quite an apt
Yeah.
description, actually, because it is quite cumbersome and slow.
Mhm.
And you want that kind of super snappy 60 hertz update. Very easy to find your functionality and whatnot. And I do think we've still got the curation element that it requires, where it is a mobile device. You shouldn't, if they are aiming for a more accessible audience, you shouldn't be spending hours generating optimized settings. It should all be kind of done for you with the ability to customize, because that is the PC strength. But I'm going to dip quickly into questions here because we've got a lot of them. First one from Andrew, really, really easy. I'm really curious about the Steam Deck acoustics. Several reviewers mentioned the fan is loud. Do you think the deck passes the significant other couch test, meaning the fan and buttons are quiet enough to play sitting next to someone else? The answer is no, it doesn't meet that test, because if you're playing a game that requires a lot of GPU power, this device is like chewing through up to 26, 27 watts. And to dissipate that heat requires a hefty cooling assembly. The fan isn't so much loud as it is high-pitched, which is arguably even worse than being loud.
The issue.
It is, yeah.
It really is an issue. I mean, they've got to get the fan RPM up high, and because there's such a small width to the thing, depth to the thing, they've got to make the fan small. And when you combine high RPM with a small fan, that's what you get. I tried it in a few areas, like at home, in like a home office or a living room. Absolutely, you're going to hear that. In the office, in like the Eurogamer office, it was all right. And I imagine on a commute, with the bustle and everything, you're not going to hear so much of it, on a bus or a train. So it's kind of, but on an airplane, gosh, you're going to wind up everyone. So
I don't know, on an airplane,
the
you've got a lot of
fuselage,
ambient, ambient
Yeah, I
engine noise
suppose.
and whatnot. But I think in a quiet lounge, and I think if somebody's trying, I mean, the beauty of the Switch is that you can be playing on the Switch, your partner can be watching TV, and nobody is interfering with the other's experience, really. But that is not the case with the deck, because the fan noise underload is appreciable. So that's that question out of the way. Going to move on to the next one, CTG867. I really enjoyed Rich's Steam Deck analysis. Thank you. It's a fascinating machine that I'm considering buying. Good luck with that. But I had some lingering questions. What happens when you insert an aftermarket NVMe or install Windows without proper drivers? Also, how good is it at emulation? If you have the time and interest, I'd love to see your findings. Thanks. Well, it's a PC. If you put in an aftermarket NVMe, you have to install the OS. So you'd need to have like a USB drive to hand. So it's not like it's not easy, but it's doable. If you install Windows without proper drivers, then I suspect the CPU side of things will be okay, but you won't have any GPU acceleration, which is a really, really bad place to be. So we still don't have those Windows drivers, by the way. We had an email from Valve saying they're being held up by AMD's legal department, but they are coming. Yeah, kind of curious. How good is it at emulation? I've not looked at this, but there are, or rather there were, videos online showing how it works. There's this curious story going around at the moment that Nintendo are zapping videos showing GameCube and Switch emulation on the deck. I've not tried those things. I think the thing to bear in mind is it is still a relatively resource constrained device, so your wins are going to be quite limited. Older systems, not a problem. I mean, if a PSP can do Mega Drive, you're not going to have too many issues with Steam Deck, right? So I'll take a look and see what existing videos are out there at the moment. The emulation side of things is intriguing to me, but not intriguing enough for me to divert from my current content schedule.
Mm-hmm. Maybe it's something I can look at when I get the deck, but at the moment, right now, that's not what we're going to be doing in the immediate future.
I mean, from my perspective, Alex, I'd love to see whether you can run your favorite RTS titles on there.
Yeah, that'd be great.
which is really interesting to see whether the flexibility of the interface of the input controls holds up. I suspect it's just going to be like the Steam controller, right?
I imagine it'll be very similar, which can be an okay experience, but mouse and keyboard. We'll see. Yeah.
But I'm really interested in seeing the optimized settings stuff, and we have to contend with the fact that on a big desktop screen watching the video, it might not look great. But we're going to be trying to optimize for what is whatever a 7-inch.
The screen experience.
800p screen.
Yeah. I did get a laugh though out of watching some of your PS4 versus Steam Deck stuff that the 1080p compression on YouTube actually kind of made them look more similar than I think they would in real life on a big screen. YouTube just destroys content. It is incredible.
It isn't great.
Yeah,
that is true. Let's move on to the next question from SJ33 in brackets Jake, Shaky Jake. I think the Steam Deck looks excellent, and I can't wait for mine. But is there a danger that PC developers will be held back just as we're finally beginning to move out of the cross-gen period? We all hope the Steam Deck will be a big success, but that success will presumably see PC developers more obliged to provide compatibility. Scalability only goes so far. Tom, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the uptake. From a developer's perspective, if there aren't, they'll be looking at the sales, the actual install base, and how much they've got to swerve out of their way to make a compatible, optimized version of their game. For cutting edge stuff, I don't know, Crisis, the upcoming Crisis, and all, anything that comes up in the vein of like Cyberpunk's. It's going to be, they can go out of their way to do something for it, but it's maybe a hard ask to rewrite everything if it just isn't working out. So yeah, I don't think, it's a hard ask. I don't think that people will be, expecting much from that.
I mean, if we look at actual next-gen stuff, forward-looking rendering, the sort of showcase example would be Nanite Lumen. You're not going to be running that on the Steam Deck, are you?
I don't think so. I mean, we have yet to try it. I'm curious what would happen. I'm also curious when something like Metro Exodus Enhanced gets the proper support, because I think it currently doesn't work.
There's no RT support as far as I can see.
Yeah. So that would be the interesting thing to see what happens in those cases. Maybe it is possible to do 30 FPS at 540p at some of the lower settings, but not every game is going to be built towards that scaling. And I don't think the install base will justify any sort of dent in the PC market that is not already covered by people still having legacy hardware like GTX 1060s and things like that. So I think, Jake, in the current near future, the install base will not warrant developers, other than for curiosity's sakes, making their own optimized settings. I don't think it's going to sway the development to make them have to, really jury-rig their engines and games to run on this thing. I don't think so.
I think the other thing to bear in mind here is just general scalability. During lockdown, there were a ton of laptops with really weak GPUs sold. We're talking millions. And addressing the audience to encompass those devices means that possibly we will see developers attempting, sort of potato level settings, fallbacks, which could work. But I think you have to put this into context. It's running the games of the here and now pretty well. I've yet to try Cyberpunk on it, but I suspect at low settings it will kind of power through, just as the last gen consoles are at least, notionally playable. So I think there will be this cutoff point. But the question is, does that cutoff point matter? Because the fact is that Steam is a gigantic library with titles stretching back decades. The device doesn't become obsolete just because it can't play the latest and greatest at 60 FPS, right? There's still, there's still a huge amount of games out there that it's going to play really well. So, yeah, absolutely. Let's move on to the next question from
this one again.
MRTNPTRS.
Martin Peters? That's what I would.
Martin Peters.
Yeah.
That would be. Yeah,
that's a good guess.
Hacker alias. With games and emulators being notorious for having many issues with AMD GPU drivers, do you think this will negatively affect games / emulators in the future on Steam Deck? Also regarding support, because AMD most likely produces a special driver for the Steam Deck that could be updated a bit later than regular drivers. He's asking whether SteamOS automatically updates the AMD GPU driver, or does Valve first have to approve it? Well, we don't know the cadence of AMD GPU drivers on Steam Deck. I think that's for sure. But I would be fairly confident that it would be bundled into the SteamOS update. I don't see why they would decouple that, because it's a fixed platform, right? In terms of, I don't really know about the issues that emulators have with AMD GPU drivers. Any insights on that, Alex?
There's been times where Vulkan backends or OGL backends don't necessarily work right out of the gate or work perfectly on AMD drivers until they get updated over time and things like that. But at the same time, I've already seen developers of emulators purposefully looking at targeting and making sure that there is already SteamOS compatibility, like that they work well. So I think this thing has enough, clout already to sway emulator developers to get express support of it. It's kind of like how when the M1 stuff came out for Apple, we already saw Dolphin pivoting to making a test and a branch that works on M1 Apple stuff. And it's the same thing with Steam Deck. So maybe it's a little bit of a question for legacy emulators, or ones that are not updated too often, or ones that have less resources. But I think your CMUs, your all the modern ones, I think they're going to be fine for the immediate to near future for sure.
Okay, on the GPU side of things, in terms of the Windows side, in the fullness of time, I would expect that just to be the standard driver, right? I think they've made strides in integrating APU drivers with the standard driver, which just kind of makes sense. But yeah, I don't really know of the implications of the AMD GPU driver on actual SteamOS side, but interesting to see how that all pans out anyway. The final question here we've got about the Steam Deck from Jonas Suchi. I'm still a little bit disappointed about the lack of VRR, variable refresh rate, on the Steam Deck, as a stable 60 FPS seems to be a little hard to achieve in some games. Which got me thinking about what Alex said a couple of times about the fact that most PC monitors can be set to a 50 Hz mode and consequently run games at 50 FPS with even frame pacing. Do you think it would be feasible for Valve to integrate the functionality of a 50 Hz mode in the Steam Deck via a software update? I think a slider in the overlay for 60, 50, 30, and even 25 FPS would be a great feature to have, given the limited power and battery. As far as I know, most panels aren't built for 40 Hz, or could that also be an option? He's going in here with his possibilities, right? Full bore. I would love to hear your thoughts. P.S. What about Switch? What about it? Okay, I can answer this one, because I did actually speak to Valve about this, because I'm finding on the Steam Deck that you hit so many bottlenecks trying to get 60 FPS in games that really require a good amount of CPU power to do that, or GPU power. And, you kind of see them float, around the sort of late 40s to early 50s, if you're lucky. And so, yes, I had exactly the same thought. And I said to Valve, how about configurable refresh rates if you can't do VRR? And they said they're going to look at it, which I think is really good news. I would temper that with caution by saying that when I went into the Linux desktop, it works just like a normal desktop PC. You go to display settings, you see what refresh rates are supported by the display, and it's just 60. There's no 50. So it would require custom tooling from Valve on that one. But I think the lack of VRR is a bit of a disappointment. But what I would say is that when you do hit specifically CPU limits on the deck, the stutter is such that even if you're in like 40 to 50 FPS territory, that is an average. Your frame times can be quite gnarly, and VRR can't always save the day there. But absolutely, it would have been a great option to have.
Yeah, it would have, definitely. I just also, in general, dislike stutters of any sort, as my most recent video content has shown. So
It's becoming a bit
VRR could
annoying.
also help that. Yeah, any sort of judder, just like I'm so annoyed by it now. I just wish developers would focus on it a bit more.
This question here ends with "What about Switch?" Question mark, exclamation point, question mark. What about Switch? I mean, you're a big Switch fan, right, Tom?
Yeah. What
So-
about Switch?
What about Switch?
What
Do you- I mean,
50 hertz on Switch maybe is the question, or
Yeah,
VRR Switch.
Yeah, like in the console space, 50 hertz was always PAL territory stuff, and it seems like that's been pushed aside in favor of a standardized 60. But yeah, I mean, our TV sets are perfectly capable of it, but it's just a shame that I wonder if it is possible to configure the LCD on the Switch and the Steam Deck to actually make it 50.
yeah, that's the question.
Change
I
it.
suspect not. That's the point. I don't think it
Yeah.
is possible. One thing to say about the 50 hertz mode potential is that there is a downside to it, which is that if you drop a frame, you're momentarily dropping down to 25 FPS rather than 30, or rather, 25 millisecond, which is quite a big jump versus 33. So there are downsides to it. You're really looking to use it for stability when you're in that kind of ballpark already. But yeah, fascinating stuff. I mean, I'm really sort of curious about the Steam Deck. I'm happy with it as a device that I like to experiment with and see what it's capable of, and to test the sort of frontier of a mobile chipset. Also, RDNA 2 on mobile, it's a winner, right? I mean, it's doing things that I didn't think were possible. When we did our direct on the Steam Deck way back when, I was anticipating that the 35 watt processor in my laptop would equate to the 15 watt processor in the Steam Deck with the architectural improvement, but it's way beyond that. It's really impressive stuff. So yeah, again, if people are actively targeting this device, even if it's just a specific profile from their existing PC port, we could see some magical stuff here, and we shall indeed be reporting on it. But look, we've been talking for 20, 25 minutes about Steam Deck. I'm talked out.
I'm also.
Are you?
Well, let's move on.
We've got a bit more to go.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the next topic. This is the big one, right? The biggest game of the moment, possibly of the year. Elden Ring, massive sales success. I mean, From Software, in terms of the sort of mass market appeal, I think they finally crossed the threshold in taking the Souls formula fully mainstream here, and it's looking absolutely phenomenal from that perspective. But there's a lot to discuss here. Alex, we've kind of discussed PC performance already until we're blue in the face. Really.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go to Tom here to talk about the consoles. I mean, we've talked about the console side of things, but there is the last gen side of things, which we should possibly address. So the video as we speak is still in production, and we've kind of found an interesting detour in the meantime. But we should probably follow up on that first of all, which was the fact that on the PS5, if you own the digital copy, you can download the PS4 version and get PS4 Pro running on PS5, locked 60 FPS. And then there was this conjecture that you can do the same on Xbox, but you'd actually need the physical copy of the game, and then you'd need to block off your console from going online in order to access the Xbox One X version on Series X under backwards compatibility. And the contention was that you would receive something similar to PS4 Pro code running on PS5. That hasn't really come to pass, has it?
I think you went all the way to game to pick up a copy, right? And yeah, we had our hopes high because this was interesting. We did hear that, okay, things weren't exactly quite right with it, but I didn't realize just how wrong it'd be. It's worse than playing just with the regular Series X native app. The frame rate's actually worse by 2 or 3 frames per second. And that's despite obviously running on the One X settings. You've got lower grass density and all these other things that they've optimized for the older last gen console. And yeah, Alex and I did this quick video just sort of diving into it. It was originally meant for the last gen analysis I was working on, and then we kind of just realized this is a little bit more interesting as a kind of. I think there's some predictability with the last gen console stuff because we've done the beta analysis, but we haven't seen the full game, to be fair. But with this, it's like, well, the question was, is there any way to play 60 FPS on any Xbox console? And the answer was a resounding no. It's impossible, and the reason it's impossible is even more surprising, which is there's a feature in the game to dynamically shift it away from 60 FPS in favor of higher visual settings, resolution, ambient occlusion, per pixel motion blur. All these things are dynamically enabled instead of to take advantage of the GPU cycles of the machine. So 60 FPS is not on the cards, and it's just frustrating but it gave us a really interesting look at how the engine works on console, and it kind of demystified the settings on PC, the auto detect rendering setting on PC.
Which, by the way, I still have no idea how you actually, because you were able to see it in action on Xbox One X, and I guess there's also evidence of it being in action on, PlayStation 5's performance mode, where with the turning on and off of motion blur at times, that seems rather arbitrary. So like, I still don't know what actually activates it on PC. I've tried. I don't know. And it also, that kind of spills over, the fact that I don't know what's actually activating it on PC when it does happen, if it does, ties over into how it's actually activating on console and why we had such an issue with this backwards compatibility thing, because it doesn't seem to be targeting a frame rate. It seems to just be kind of targeting whether or not the GPU is being used heavily or something like that. Like it's more saturated in some arbitrary way that we can't understand, because the game is still not hitting a certain target frame rate. And that's the big point of Tom's video, that it's not at all a target frame rate.
But it does on maybe it's just the sheer GPU multiplier between PS4 Pro and PS5, but it is hitting 60 on PS5. That's kind of what's weirding me out a bit.
We talked about that, and I think it's literally because they have, for some bizarro reason, they don't have a cap on the resolution that the Xbox One X version can have, so it automatically just ramps up to 4K for some reason, as well as adding in these settings. And on PS4 Pro, they did actually, because I wish they did this on other consoles, but they actually had a more sensible resolution cap of 1800 CB, and which I think the lack of resolution there is actually the thing that is allowing PlayStation 5 to be so performant in that PS4 Pro mode. Otherwise, I think it would have the exact same problem that we see on Xbox Series X with this Xbox One X compatibility thing.
Yeah, it is fascinating to see how it all played out, and to get some answers to bizarre questions that we've been kind of dealing with during the Elden Ring review period. We're going to go into some questions here. I guess the first two are kind of deeply related, so I'll do both of them. First one from Legendary, dairy as in a dairy, Legendary Math Debater.
Oh, come on!
If you're trying to top agonizing rectal pain,
it's like right there.
You've not quite reached that level. But anyway, his question: do you feel like games with bad performance and optimization, like Elden Ring, can deserve the 10 out of 10? "Quote unquote masterpiece" label? Concrete Llama's question. From Software makes some incredible games, some of my absolute favorites, but the fact we're still seeing performance-related technical issues in their games is concerning. Is there any indication as to what is actually causing the poor frame rate in Elden Ring? It's almost as if they left some debug settings or a weirdly expensive setting on and didn't think to turn it off. At this point, I feel like From should just make their games, then when they think they're finished, get a third party to immediately remaster them.
That's good.
So, yeah, I mean, this is an interesting one, right? Because it's all about game design in all manner of aspects versus technical performance. Because I actually, I've played Elden Ring a little bit now. I'm not a big fan of these games, but I've played it. I can appreciate the quality of the game design. I can appreciate the thought that's gone into the mechanics of stuff like combat, leveling, character development. I think the world design is technically fairly basic, but what they're doing in that world is brilliant, and I think that the designs of the various entities in it are also excellent. But you do have these technical issues, and they don't seem to be going away, do they, Alex?
No, they don't. They've had them ever since ever. Like John was even
on the PC side,
yeah.
the transition from DX11 to DX12 has actually made it worse.
Yeah, we've seen this before in the past, though, with other, because you have to, bite off more than you can chew is a real thing regarding DX12, where all the stuff the driver did in the background, invisible to the developer, even making their games better without them knowing it, that's all gone for the most part. And then you have all this responsibility, and it requires a lot of responsibility. So much so that Oxide Games, for example, dropped their DX12 Vulkan path because it required so much responsibility and maintenance over time. And then having a developer that already has issues shipping games in acceptable technical quality, then it was just a recipe for disaster. And I think it bears out. I just want to answer really quickly the 10 out of 10 masterpiece thing. One, I don't like actually game ratings. I really like the Eurogamer and more, I would say, journalistic-driven style of rating games or reviewing games, where it's a recommendation or an essay describing things, and maybe on an emotional level as well as a mechanical one. And I think that's the way we could get across the technical issues to people, that it's a more nuanced thing. Yes, the game has incredibly brilliant design, like Rich was just talking about, but at the same time, there should be an asterisk in the article or a separate section that describes technical things, or at least visible technical things, because I don't expect every reviewer out there to have the eyes and the tools that we approach our games reviews with. But still, it has to be a part of it, because in this case, at least with the Steam DX12 PC version, it is a huge controversy. You just go into they're usually, let's just say on Reset Era, the PC performance thread is maybe at the most 10 or 12 pages long. I think it's like 40 or 50 for Elden Ring, of people just wailing at the game and trying so many different things to try and get it to run as they wish. And I think there's a lot of placebo in there, and I think there's a lot of people just giving up hope and just saying, yeah, it runs better today, whatever that means. Like it's not running better today.
Well, that's the thing, right, Alex? Because it could run better today we'll talk about this later. But if you've got a precompiled shader that was generated during a stutter in your first gameplay playthrough, it may not appear in the second because it's been cached. So yeah, I mean, so how can people claim things have been fixed unless they're going to nuke their installation and reinstall it?
That's what I did for the review. I always kept nuking my installation. Yeah, because
we actually thought when patch 102 drops that it looks like things are better, but it wasn't. It was just the stuff that you'd played before was pre-cached. You ran it on your mainstream PC.
Yeah, and then it was
a disaster.
Revealed itself for being even worse. What is Concrete Llama here? I do think that what Concrete Llama actually may be getting at is, I think that there's publisher oversight failures in this case, because as a studio, they are bound by contracts and release dates, and they have their own technical QA department, and they may have different goals than what makes for a good reviewable game, for example. And I think this is the part where the publisher has to come in with their own QA knowledge and their own understanding of where the reviews may go and say, actually, right now, the game is completely playable, but it's not in an acceptable state. And maybe it comes out in a different form at another point. And I think that's what should have happened with Elden Ring.
I think there should have been a PC network test.
Yeah, that should have been great. Yeah.
I mean, these issues would have surfaced months ago and could possibly have been fixed for launch. But I'm still curious about this concept of a brilliant game actually having relatively poor performance, Tom. And you are actually a big fan of these titles, but the concept of technical elements not being where they should be, this is nothing new for From Software titles, right? So where does this sit with you?
I mean, I've got to look at the games that I've always positioned as a 10 out of 10 across all the years I've been playing games, like Dark Souls 1, it never was performant on 360 or PS3, and the PC version was notoriously not wonderful.
Yeah.
But obviously a classic. You got, Shadow of the Colossus on PS2. Loved it. It doesn't matter that the frame rate was bad. Shenmue 2 on Dreamcast, not a great frame rate. It goes on and on. The Last Guardian, it's so. I think if you're emotionally invested enough in a game and the story in the world that it's built up, you can, it's a suspension of disbelief. You can just push aside those issues, but with the caveat that if they're so glaringly bad, like they are on the PC version of this, then it's like, there's no way. It's too intrusive. So for me on Elden Ring, the console version is obviously the version that I'm playing right now for DF testing. And the fact is, the frame rate's not great, but it is still very playable, very enjoyable, and it's not like made
it's
my
not
experience...
game breaking.
No.
That's the point.
Not game breaking. So yeah, I'm a bit torn on that one. 10 out of 10. Yeah, sure. If only they'd just addressed that, added a 30 FPS cap that was evenly frame paced or something like that. But I think if people are happy with it, then fair enough. I'm just trying to think of comparable things in other mediums, like books or cinema.
It doesn't happen there, because they would get panned.
Yeah,
They
poor
would get
paper
panned.
quality.
Yeah, paper quality is like in the middle of like the new Spider-Man. Is there a massive hitch or stutter coming in to ruin the moment? It's never really. So
Yeah, it is pretty weird, and I think I don't know if that's special to the video game medium, because I don't think this stuff flies in film. Film get panned for it. Like Tenet was recently panned for the technical quality of its dialogue audio. I remember that, and or even the last film from, I forget the name of the director.
Well, Bane.
Yeah,
in,
Bane,
Dark
right?
Knight Rises is the classic example. It's like the teachers in Peanuts.
Yes.
Charlie Brown.
Yeah, it's like the exact same thing. I don't think it flies in film, so it does surprise me a little bit that in video game medium, where it's even more interactive and the technical aspects are more readily apparent in every interaction with the thing, that it is more forgivable.
The reason I've not been chuckling at your comments, Tom, I've been chuckling at this concept that From should just make their games, then when they think they're finished, get a third party to immediately remaster them, which kind of leads us on to the next question from Wouter van der Ridder. In an interview, From Software claimed that they felt pressured by Bluepoint's successful take on Demon's Souls in terms of graphical fidelity. Since the release of Elden Ring, the graphics as well as the performance aren't up to par with the Demon's Souls remake. Should From Software have reached out to Bluepoint to inherit some of their expertise? Is it common for studios to collaborate on such a project? You can't just inherit expertise, and you can't really. This is the thing, right? One of the classic comments that's emerged from this Elden Ring situation is they should just move it to Unreal Engine 5.
Fixes it.
Which, let's just do that. Only take an afternoon, and then we'll pop out for a drink. But this kind of level of collaboration that's being suggested with Bluepoint is like, fundamentally re-architecting the whole project, really. As much as we'd like to see it. But yeah, I guess maybe they did feel pressured by Bluepoint's successful take on Demon's Souls, but the engine isn't. I think the thing we have to accept is that there is a technical ceiling with From Software at the moment, and it seems to be based on their technology. I don't know, Alex. Should they move on to a different end? Should they move on to Unreal Engine or something like this?
Well, based on the PS4 Pro performance on PS5, it is technically executable to run it well. So there is a software, like it does actually run well somewhere. So I don't think it's the basic engine. I think it's just design. Like their technical design is so ununderstandable.
Right.
Like I don't know what they're targeting, and some visual things I think they just don't do it right. Like there's best practices that the industry has established for a while now, and they just kind of like collectively ignore them. Maybe they don't have the time, publisher insight, all these things to actually get them in there. But I said it last week when I was talking to John. I was like, the fact that they have like so many non-shadow casting lights in the game in areas where there's only non-shadow casting lights, like usually like the design of a lighting in a scene is you always have at least one motivated shadow casting light, so you get those shadows from somewhere at least. But From Games always, ever since Dark Souls 2 was revealed, just don't have all these non-shadow casting lights everywhere, and it makes the game look worse than it arguably could, based upon the performance I've seen in it. So it's really, I wish they just had different technical design goals.
I think what's interesting about Wouter's question here is that we actually do now have an example of a From Software game that is not just technically competent, but technically brilliant. And I think maybe that does reset expectations, right?
I think there's kind of a couple of thoughts on how this would work. Like, Bluepoint have been in this position before with they made a great remaster of Shadow of the Colossus, right? And then The Last Guardian came out, and there's some parallels with how people treated that game, and they were saying if only it had a Bluepoint remaster, but it's the same. I think The Last Guardian and Elden Ring have the same problem in that they are both running on kind of a legacy code. There's a long, you can see like the mechanics and parts of the engine have such there's a link going all the way back to Demon's Souls, the original PS3 version, in just how things work visually, and they are being sort of anchored a little bit by that. And yeah, there's not a heck of a lot they can do besides an engine refresh. We see it in like the Creation Engine titles with Bethesda as well, but this is nowhere near that bad. It's just these are quirks and characteristics of the engine that from their end maybe are hard to work around. From Bluepoint's perspective, if they were to collaborate, that would make their position very difficult to actually do offer wholesale changes. But what they could do is maybe offer some kind of common sense advice on things like 30 FPS cap. Maybe there's a workaround there that maybe there's some expertise there in how to generate an even cap.
Well, that's the thing, right? Demon's Souls runs at 30 FPS correctly on PS5 if you use the quality mode.
So there's some expertise there, some knowledge at Bluepoint which might be transferable to just basic level how to render the world.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. I think it's one that we could disappear down a big rabbit hole on, so let's try and keep it focused. Elden Ring is the latest game in a long series to feature shader compilation and other stuttering on PC. This is the point, right? On the user's side, what can be done with hardware and software to mitigate this in lieu of a proper fix? Would better CPU, memory, or SSD performance help? What about playing with double or triple buffer VSync or capping the game's frame rate? So, Alex, we have seen some examples of like highly tuned DDR5 setups actually mitigating some of the stutter on this title, but this is like a nuclear option, right? Just ditching your entire platform to get a high-end Alder Lake system with fast DDR5, which is then tuned to get. Because we should say that John has an Alder Lake system, but with DDR4, and it's still a stutterfest. So yeah, what do you reckon about this question then, from Jonathan Hayhurst?
There will be CPUs that will be powerful enough to compile that shader just in time at a millisecond window that will not ultimately disrupt the frame rate so much. But that's like really nth game future stuff. That's a solution. Another solution is, yes, dropping to 30 or 40 FPS cap or something like that, because some of the shader compilations or traversal stutters don't like crest over 23 milliseconds. Some are below that, and in which case, or even those that are like between 23 and 33, they'll become invisible in the 33 millisecond range, which is something that Rich has seen on Steam Deck, I believe. And then there's also the other option, which I think is bizarre, and we should not be constantly advocating for this, but it is the running the DXVK Proton way of playing games, of translating the game into DX12. And that, in the Vulkan side of things, can do asynchronous shader compilation, and it does the way where it like doesn't wait for the shader to actually be compiled. It compiles it later, and it like just throws up a generic shader, I believe, in the meantime. And it just so you can have like effects not appearing unnecessarily and things like that. I think that's how it works from what I've read so far. I don't actually like advocating for that because it requires such a, like, you have to set up an entire translation layer. You have to sacrifice GPU and CPU performance while doing this. I don't think that's the way forward for PC gaming. I think the user should really just expect better things from their games in the end.
I mean, shader compilation stutter is an issue, but the other thing that's been coming up, which was actually, I mean, it's rare that I see developers on Twitter kind of dumping on other developers, but when the updates that Valve put out for Elden Ring optimization came out, it's like, hey, these guys seem to have an issue with their understanding of the DX12 API. Actually, I've been talking to Valve about this because a lot of these issues are mitigated on the Steam Deck of all places. And they're saying that the majority of the big hitches that they've seen are more to do with the game creating many thousand resources, such as command buffers at certain points, which was making our memory manager go into overdrive trying to handle it. They're caching those allocations more aggressively, which seems to have helped. There's a ton going on there. Steam Deck actually is quite interesting in that I was asking them about the shader compilation stutter, and quote here, on the deck, we take, hold on a minute. Yeah, on the deck, we have on the Linux Proton side, rather, we have a pretty extensive shader pre-caching system with multiple levels of source level and binary cache representations, preceded and shared across users, and on the deck, they take that to the next level. Because they have a unique GPU, the majority of shaders are actually pre-built on their servers and downloaded to the end user, which basically sorts out that problem. Which also actually addresses the question from King Penumbra next. Elden Ring would be a DX12 game on the Xbox platform, which will use DX12. So why doesn't it seem that any of them suffer from shader compilation issues in any game? Well, that's the thing, right? It's a fixed platform. All the shaders can be generated, pre-cached, included on the install, and it's not an issue, right, Alex?
That's exactly it. And I actually do wonder if From is actually only rolling DX12 on PC. I know they said stuff about ray tracing, but let's just completely forget that at the moment. I do actually wonder if, because with the new XDK environment, or GDK, that it puts out DX12 only, as far as I know, if you're targeting Xbox Series consoles. So I do actually wonder if this is a side effect of them actually wanting to do their Xbox and PC development at the exact same time, but they just didn't get the PC side so well.
That's interesting. I wonder if there's a way we can tell if a game has been developed on the GDK.
That'd be an interesting thing to look at, yeah.
Yeah. Wow, we're still going in with shader compilation here. A question from Sloth. A lot of shader compilation issues are left to developers to mitigate in DX12 currently. But are there more things companies like AMD and NVidia and Valve can do to help improve the experience for users? For example, more ways for pre-calculated shaders to be shared among players for the same card and drivers, or Valve requiring that games integrate shader compilation with Steam so players can queue up and compile shaders in advance through the GUI in a similar manner to the downloads window. This is the thing, right? I think the problem here, Alex, is that there's like an infinite combination of PC components out there. So pre-compilation is a lot more difficult, right?
It is more difficult, but there's millions of PC users. I get the feeling that, I don't like blaming the IHVs for this, but I feel like they could do something here because they have game-ready drivers already as a concept, you know? And I feel like, at least for the most recent, two recent GPU generations, let's say the most recent RTX, and let's say, you know, RDNA 1 and RDNA 2, I feel like AMD and NVIDIA at some level could try and package that through their, you know, automatic downloading services, because they already are doing things like auto-optimizing game configs and .inis. and things like that. I get the feeling they could do it, but it's not as possible as you think, because as an example, the person here had this idea of like caching the shaders in a GUI that isn't actually in the game beforehand. To actually get all the shaders compiled and cached, it actually, in actuality, just requires the game to be run on something, and having a lot of combinations of things happening on screen and going through a lot of portions of the game. It's not as easy as it thinks. I don't know actually of a good automated way to do it, because we've talked in the background with people about how it's done in UE4. I've talked about it with developers, Rich has as well too, and it actually requires like going through the game and having things play out and collected and then cached afterwards. It requires some level of both non-automated and automated playthroughing of the game. It's not an easy thing. I think, I don't know how it's solved. I really want it to be solved though here. Sorry if that's not a really good answer to the question.
I mean, the nuclear option is what we saw in the launch version of Horizon.
Yes.
Where Horizon Zero Dawn just sits there for 5 or 10 minutes compiling them.
I prefer that at this point in time than having my first playthrough of a game being so disrupted.
Absolutely. And your first encounter with any effect or material or whatever leading to a stutter that can be up to a quarter of a second. It's kind of crazy, right? That's the end of the Elden Ring questions. There were more, but these are the pertinent ones. And I suspect this story will run and run. I just think, ultimately, if Valve can come up with optimizations that improve the experience, it can't be impossible for the developer to look at that and think, okay, so these are the problems. How do we address them? See, this is sort of basic logic, but let's move on. So this week is described as a massive cyber attack, sort of shades of Skynet, the future Earth there, but actually it's just NVIDIA being leaked. Being hacked, and their secrets being leaked. Foremost amongst them, I guess there was sort of a confirmation of this gigantic 4090 that's going to consume a huge amount of power, but probably more pertinent to our audience was apparent confirmation of the Switch Pro specification. Basically that a mobile Tegra class processor typically used by the automotive industry is going to be repurposed for the Switch Pro, Switch 2, whatever you want to call it, Super Switch, Switch Model S. And yes, the T239 chipset is what it's known. And there's also confirmation of DLSS being used, specifically the 2.2 variant, but I suspect that's just old data. The reason we can kind of suspect there is a link there is that they're talking about NVN2. Now, NVN, the original, was the low-level graphics API for the Switch. So it kind of, logic suggests that NVN2 is for the new Switch. So we've got this really capable Ampere-class GPU. We've got DLSS. Does this excite you, Tom?
Well, from the perspective of an updated Switch, yes. I'm not massively, a massive user on PC side, but it's kind of, if it trickles down to the next Switch, this is kind of a big deal. And yeah, does this tally with the other reports of what we know about Switch? Is this far beyond what we thought would come up the Switch?
It ties in with all of the leaks that were coming previously. Crop Height 7 Kimi is a profoundly accurate leaker, and way back when he was talking about this T239 chipset being for Nintendo Switch 2 or Super Switch or whatever. And I'm just quickly looking at the schematics now of this chip. 2048 CUDA cores, 12 ARM Cortex A78AE Hercules cores. This looks like a really potent piece of kit. But it's Nintendo then, not huge. I mean, here's the thing, right? One thing that was sort of cast doubt on this initial rumor was the fact that Nintendo aren't really obsessed with performance. They're obsessed with with how it's used. right? And I think that's kind of been borne out with the original Switch, is that yes, the actual amount of compute power you might have is actually rather low, but give it to developers, see what they can do with it, and you get some great results. I think the one thing to bear in mind here is that this chip does look rather large, and I suspect that once again we will be looking at low clocks to meet a specific battery target. Thoughts on this, Alex?
That's exactly what I want to see, because we saw that with Tegra as well. You know, it could clock quite a bit higher, and people have done that with Switch modding. So I think that's the way this will bear out in the end. I think it's awesome for people who love Switch and love the docked experience on Switch. I also think it bears really well for the eventuality of there actually being able to be ports of PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X games. The memory situation is the one thing that is always, I think, the only Achilles heel of these kind of things at all, because we see that already in Xbox Series S. I imagine it'll also be something to think about when people are developing games for the next Switch. I'm just at this point only curious about when it'll launch, because I think a lot of these files were originally from about a year and a half ago, maybe even longer, referencing timeframes that are around now. So I guess Switch 2 Pro, whatever it's called, was maybe shelved at one point and then brought into existence again. I don't know, but I'm just curious about when this launches.
Yeah, I think the addition of DLSS is a big deal for it as well. That'll give it that extra scalability. Something that, you know, it could really rely on. And I think absolutely, like, they won't ship it with the max core clock speeds that it will go out with. It will be cut down, but yeah, it should be really interesting. I mean, the idea, I think, for me is a 4K Switch would be the most exciting upgrade. Something that's, you can scale the old games up to a 4K set, but whether that's feasible or not is gonna, I think, come down to the original software, because a lot of those games are only set to scale to 1080p, which is a little bit of a shame.
There is still a certain amount of doubts based on this leak. For example, everyone at one point was thinking that DLSS was now open source because these files are out there, but some of the files seem to be stuff that you could just download anyway off the internet. So yeah, it's not by, you know, this leak isn't sort of the definitive statement, as it were. Also, I would strongly urge people to watch Alex's video about the potential implementation of DLSS on a Switch. I mean, this is looking like this documentation suggests it's a straight port of DLSS 2.2, which on the one hand, its quality is superb, but on the other hand, comes with a significant computational overhead, even if you've got the tensor cores. So yeah, that's going to be, I would have expected to have seen a more bespoke implementation, possibly with quality compromises to get the performance up. Maybe we'll still see that. But yeah, certainly interesting that we actually have this insight. But yeah, it's kind of unfortunate, the situation that brought it about. But there we go. Let's move on to the next topic. Final one here. Just quickly, it's been announced or revealed that Resident Evil Remake 2 and 3 and Resident Evil 7 are going next gen. They're getting patches for at least Xbox Series X and S. Almost certainly PS5. What's happening here, Alex? Because you've looked at some screenshots, right?
Yeah, so they released 3 screenshots, I believe, of all these games, different stages in them. I have one here. I'm going to send it side by side to Audie. I actually will send it, Audie, of Resident Evil 3 in the hallway with the reflections, and you can see in the side by side that it does actually look pretty different. The reflections are more like the ones we saw in Resident Evil Village. So they're a little bit blocky, but they're way better than the SSR that we saw in any of these remake games or these Reach for the Mood games. And as well, if you look in the little back there behind those boxes there, you'll see that it's also a bit darker. And I think that is because they're using the diffuse lighting that they also had in Resident Evil Village, which will add in some local bounce lighting as well too, which is really cool. So that's really all I have to say about it. I'm just curious about what it'll run and target on the current gen platforms, and I'm also curious or not whether it'll be an AMD sponsored title on PC like we saw with Resident Evil Village, or it will be something else. But that's about it.
I mean, we could see the multiple modes from Devil May Cry 5 Special Edition, which I guess is possibly the closest parallel, which is to say an existing last gen game is updated for current gen. So I don't know, increased resolution, ray tracing,
120 FPS.
Maybe even 120 hertz,
possibly,
which was a thing on that.
But yeah, interesting stuff. I hope to see those titles soon. And specifically, Resident Evil 7 could be quite an interesting one. But yeah, let's move on. We're running over time here, what with all this Elden Ring and Steam Deck discussion. But let's go straight into questions brought to us by supporters of the DF Supporter Program. Going to kick off with a quick one, I think. I think we've kind of addressed this scenario before. It's from Lorenzo Bracco. To John and the team. John's busy. Do you think that... he's not here. Do you think that GT7 was held back by its cross-gen nature, and to what degree? Talking more generally, we have seen some great cross-gen scaling in titles like Forza on Xbox and Horizon on PlayStation. But that's purely on the graphical side of things. What about the actual core design and gameplay of cross-gen games that have to run on the weak CPUs and mechanical hard drives of last gen? Coming back to Gran Turismo, fans have been asking for more cars on track, but GT7 brings no improvement in this sense, if I'm not mistaken. Possibly a PS4 CPU limitation, question mark? Thoughts, question mark?
Question mark?
Yes, Tom.
I mean, John covered this in his excellent video on PS5 even. You can get frame rate drops with enough cars on the track, with enough weather effects, and on certain tracks. So there are some limits even on the current gen systems, which are worth bearing in mind. But at a fundamental level, it does seem like there are other racing games which, I mean, when we're looking at the future of Gran Turismo and what we want from a true next-gen leap, you've got to look at stuff like what's working on a physics level, what's hammering the CPUs especially, which is the bottleneck for the last gen, obviously. And if you're thinking about that, you're looking at iRacing or other pure racing sim types where every part of the car is simulated, and it is kind of the top to bottom reworking of how every car works. That, to me, feels like a more effective use of the processing power of PS5 than what is, already there is a great looking game. The track design maybe could use some, a bit more flourish, but it's a gorgeous game. So yeah, I think if we're looking at the fundamentals, physics on the cars are probably the way forward, and that is probably where PS4 will hold us back.
That sounds pretty reasonable to me. Looking at John, I recorded a video with John where we looked at the differences between PS4, PS4 Pro, and PS5. And yeah, simulation-wise, it is the same game. The fact that you can even run the replays from PS4 Pro on PS5 and vice versa shows that it is actually the same game. And that is the normal cross-gen stuff. I don't know. I don't play any of these things like iRacing, so I don't know how much better the simulation makes the car game in itself or the feel. One thing I would really have loved to have seen is like the Wreckfest kind of thing, where they do soft body simulation of cars. So when you hit things, like you'll see like the proper dents, like what we saw in the end of the Matrix. I would keep wanting to say end of the Matrix, the Matrix Awakens demo, where we also saw something very similar on the cars there, which was really cool. That's definitely for the next GT when they dump PS4 and PS4 Pro. But in the meantime, I think the areas where they did improve the game are readily visible. It does, I think, look quite a bit better on PlayStation 5. On every single thing that John talked about in his video that you will be seeing soon enough there. Yeah, that's really all I can say about that. I think we're in this cross-gen period, and it's going to be a while, though, before we see games that wholly focus on like actually utilizing the new CPUs in a way that is more than just increasing the frame rate or having a more stable frame rate.
Like a bit of a contentious point that it became a cross-gen game almost in the marketing after it was initially pushed forward that it might be a PS5 exclusive. And I think there might have been a pivot there. But, in terms of the development of the game, it was always, capable, I'm sure, of running on PS4. It's whether... Because, this only happened a year ago, so they can't have pivoted too hard away from PS4 development.
Well, here's the thing, right? I don't think it was a pivot. I think it was always intended to be cross-gen. Because, fundamentally, GT7, as John identified, is built on the GT Sport engine. So, it cut back what you're doing on PS5 or scale up from what you're doing on PS4. And, that's what we're getting. And fundamentally, it makes sense because there are, from a business perspective, there are, 120 million PS4 class systems out there. And I think the thing to bear in mind is that, saying Rome wasn't built in a day, games are not built in a year or 2 years. They take, especially prolifically digital games, they take many years to create. So the concepts that of, GT7 being held back by the PS5, for most of the development period of GT7, I would suspect they would not have had final PlayStation 5 hardware to actually address. So, this is the thing, actual generational leaps. It's not just the hardware, it's about the software, and software takes time. And you can't immediately expect nanite to crop up on everything, nanite class geometry to crop up on every single game out there. It's a developmental process that's years in the making. And it can kind of only really be fully polished once they actually have the hardware, which in itself takes years to develop. So we can't actually expect games to be, pushing next gen ultra hard from day one. It's just not really viable. So especially in a title like this, which has to recoup many, many years, millions, multi-millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of investment. And so it's just sort of practical reality, really. It's not being held back. It's just that we're early in the generation. And I think the reason why we're getting cross-gen is because for the first time ever, pretty much, we've got 2 generations of hardware that are based on the same fundamental building blocks, x86 processors and Radeon GPUs. So it kind of is an enabling factor, which just wasn't possible on prior gens. But I would contend that early games from the PS4 era were, they were still held back. But they weren't held back by PS3 or whatever. They were just held back by the fact that it's early in the generation. But yeah, interesting nonetheless. Quick question to address here from Robert Brown. Would you consider an enhanced PS5 that's more XT than Pro to be worthwhile? The full 40 compute units, higher clocks and faster RAM, but using the same die as the PS5 Slim. Even with the current generation consoles, some games still seem to end up in the frame rate no man's land. Is slightly more power the answer, or do we need a solution like VRR? So I think what Robert is suggesting here, Alex, is essentially like a
GPU refresh.
GPU refresh. Or in the case, we've actually got a pretty good example here. The RX 5700 has 36 compute units. 5700 XT has 40. So it is literally an XT scenario, as Robert says here. Yes, you get more performance. Yes, you'll get more stable frame rates, but it's not a game-changing product that requires a whole new SKU, surely.
Yeah, I don't. This also feels very weirdly PC. Like, if you're just really concerned about these things, just buy a PC is what I always say. It's I don't mean to be mean about it, but it feels like.
Yeah, I mean, potentially you're looking at 10 to 15% more performance. The other difference between the 5700 and the XT was clock, which probably was arguably more impactful than the CU count.
Turned to be, yeah.
Next question. Hold on, it's such a long question that I have to expand. have to expand the window to read it all. From Luke Oliver. High DF performance has always been a function of both computing power and game code efficiency. However, with the disappointing performance of recent titles such as Elden Ring, Halo Infinite and GTA Remastered, is it fair to say that raw compute is becoming increasingly less relevant factor in the performance equation? To put it another way, as hardware becomes more powerful, can we expect to see more games with technical issues, such as random stuttering and frame drops, that can't easily be attributed to hardware constraints? Alternatively, will we see a brighter future where more powerful hardware smooths out most of the bumps we see in current gen games? This is a difficult one, right, Alex? Because you could have the most powerful GPU on the planet, but Elden Ring's still going to stutter.
Yeah, so I don't think more powerful smoothing out games is going to happen. This is something that always actually happens in hardware and software development over time, where we've massively increased amount of powers from the 486 days, yet the basic amount of compute time required to open up a web browser since Windows 95 is, and it does almost the exact same thing, right? So this is something that is always talked about in circles, like development circles, but I think the end goal here is actually creating a system and software that is more easily made in general at the cost of compute power. Yes, that is not like great, but I think we should try and have development systems, APIs, whatever, and hardware that enables easy development instead of more complex to the metal, whatever kind of development that extracts the most performance always. That's kind of my 2 cents about this generic problem that you've presented here.
I think there's also a lot of scenarios where, obviously developers in the PC space can't target specific hardware. So a lot of things we're seeing on the console space, like dynamic resolution scaling, should be more heartily embraced by developers. Because that, going back to this notional example of the PS5 XT that has 4 more compute units, the difference between those experiences would be marginal to non-existent if the game had dynamic resolution scaling implemented. And we've actually got use case scenarios of that with Xbox Series X versus PlayStation 5, where yes, notionally it's running at a faster resolution, higher resolution, but it's changing all the time. You can't really tell the difference. Yeah, interesting one, but I just think scalability, it is about software at the end of the day, software working with hardware. But yes, there we go. Last question here. We've actually got a couple of questions we had a question earlier actually, which I missed about, and I think I might have deleted it now, but it was, here it goes. James the Naked Snake was asking about the inevitable push for 8K next gen. And we got this question here from Sven Darling. Alex, do you think rasterization performance will be less important in the PC GPU space in the future? With a 4K canvas becoming the norm, it's hard to see 8K becoming a thing, and diminishing returns on frame rates above 120 144, except for esports. Pushing more pixels than 4K 144 doesn't make a lot of sense, and we are almost there already with high-end GPUs. Maybe the increased transistor count in future GPUs could be used for other things. More ray tracing, geometry processing, tessellation, AI, geometry generation, etc. This is already happening, right? Because with the Turing age of the GPU, NVIDIA actually dedicated a lot of die space to features that wouldn't actually be used for some time.
It's less of a question, more of a statement in that aspect, but I agree with the statement. I think, like Rich said, the Turing architecture points that fixed function specific, well, it's not even necessarily fixed function in the RT unit if you think about it for everything, but fixed function or the tensor core, because it is actually doing some sort of generic thing on a level. It's not the same. I actually think what the initial thing that is the first part of this question was like less focus on rasterization performance. I actually think we're going to see less focus on the performance of those things in the pipeline that do pure only one thing in rasterization, which is why mesh shaders were introduced, for example, as a programmable interface for doing rasterization functions. So yeah, I agree with that. I'm just really curious about what it means in the future, because right now we've seen the way NVIDIA and Intel are going to be doing their ray tracing acceleration. I'm just really curious about how AMD accelerates on that path and does something maybe different, or the way NVIDIA and Intel are going to iterate on their ray tracing acceleration in the future. Because, you know, there's still bottlenecks there that they have a lot of really interesting probably use cases in solving, like the way they can solve those bottlenecks. I'm really curious how it's going to be done.
The NVIDIA leaks that have recently emerged about the next-gen GPUs suggest that the 4090 is going to be something like up to 2 times the rasterization performance, but with over 2 times the power consumption, which, you know, is kind of nuts.
I don't know about that. I don't know if I want that in my PC. I will want it in my PC, but will I actually want it in my PC? I don't know.
You know, I calculate that just running the GPU for like, you know, X amount of time in my PC is actually going to that level of GPU power is actually going to significantly impact my electricity bill.
Yeah, it really will for me too.
I mean, it's like they're talking about 800 watt TGPs, which is kind of nuts, right? 800 watts. I mean, we are approaching sort of the lower end electric heaters.
Yes, we really are. I mean, I already don't heat my room in the winter, my work room. I don't know how it is for you too, but
I don't heat it all year round.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, sorry, I don't need to do it as well in summer.
Yeah, it's kind of nuts, right? Mm-hmm. But going back to this other question about 8K resolution here, I'm going to talk about the question a bit more length. James the Naked Snake here. Do you think we should or would ever push for 8K given the extremely high detail of 4K? I personally don't see the point. I'm not even sure most will notice the difference, though admittedly I've never personally witnessed 8K. I'd rather this not be the point. We start focusing on detail, frame rate, and Mr. Batalia's favourite, ray tracing. So, Tom, do you want an 8K screen, and do you want to have an 800 watt GPU to power it?
No, on both counts really. I don't think I could afford the electricity bill, and also the screen. I am very happy with my 4K OLED. I could only envisage like a situation where, with 8K, you come into a house and the entire wall is now a massive canvas, and that's like, I'm actually struggling. I don't know if you find this, but sometimes even to pick out the difference between a Blu-ray and a 4K disc, there's sometimes not much between them.
It depends on the processing, yeah, but I agree with you in there. Yeah.
Sometimes there's a good transfer which looks properly 4K. You can see the film grain. Like I was watching Total Recall last night, and it was a lot of fun. You can see all the film grain on the original 35mm reel.
Delicious.
But but that aside, 8K, there's not much calling for it. Like from a film viewing perspective, from a gaming perspective, it's so energy hungry. I just can't see the value paying back on the cost.
I mean, I do have an 8K screen, and when you actually look at it, it just looks like a really in a living room at sort of distance. It just looks like 4K, but with really good anti-aliasing, which kind of makes sense, right? Especially in the current sort of era of games that don't really focus on resolution as such, precision edges and that kind of thing. We've kind of moved into the sort of more post-process / filmic era. So it doesn't really make sense to be on multiple levels over and above the sort of coolness factor of, hey, I'm actually looking at this at 8K, and the detail levels can be terrific, but it's not really going to really sort of make a difference. And we're kind of at the point now where we're still advocating that you don't really need native 4K resolutions in the era of temporal accumulation, in the era of DLSS and whatnot. But, interesting question nonetheless. I think the one thing to bear in mind about rasterization performance increasing is that, the tensor cores, the RT cores are all plumbed into the main shaders. So if you increase those things, you kind of also increase rasterization by default, right? So it's just about the balance between them. And I don't think we're going to be going to full path tracing for quite some time. So more raster is always going to be a good thing. Maybe not the 800 watts though. In fairness, the NVIDIA leak does talk about the lower end chips in the stack. There does seem to be a big sort of drop down when we go down to the lower end chips in terms of their setups and potential power requirements. So I don't think it's going to be a sort of power disaster.
I think one just also can't forget, like I always notice this when I take out the 3090 and I plug in a 3080 or something like that, that a lot of this is also just from the memory. You know, like memory is pretty power hungry. It's also fighting for like the VRM, and it's a big contentious, warm thing there. And I think the lower end stacks with 16, 12, whatever, how much VRAM they have, are just going to by virtue just be so much more efficient than this monster apparently that they're going to bring out with the 4090.
Okay, but that's it. That's the final question, and therefore the end of this show. Please do like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed the content. The bell there for notionally instant notifications. I've no idea if it actually works consistently or not, but please do ring it because it's great apparently. And DF supporter program. So much going on there. So much bonus material. So much awesome discourse with our brilliant community. And yes, much to enjoy there. So please do consider that. But that's all from us for now. Thanks for watching.